we are pleased to have with us Dr. Nikki Keddie, Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Specializing in movements in Iran and other Muslim countries, Dr. Keddie is past president of the Middle East Studies Association of Northern America. Dr. Keddie has written 9 books, including Roots of Revolution, An Interpretive History of Modern Iran. Iran, I'm sorry. Tonight, Dr. Keddie will address mass movements in the Muslim world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nikki Keddie.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and be part of this exciting looking program that has been sent to me. I admire all your fortitude for showing up at so many events, although I know different people show up at different ones. From looking at your student newspaper and hearing oral reports, I see that I'm expected somehow to speak either about the Islamic revival in one case or the Iranian Revolution in another. I guess when people read mass movements or see my name, those are the 2 things they think of. However, I try to be very virtuous and actually do something on the very broad topic that was wanted, which is mass movements in the Muslim world, so that these 2 topics I just mentioned will come in only partially into what I have to say. I've been off trying to learn something about other parts of the Muslim world that I know much less about. It's always good to start off with a question, which I won't answer right away, in relation to what I just said, of which 4 countries in the world have the largest Muslim populations. I always pull this on my classes and sometimes on my colleagues, and they all do very badly. And I'll tell you at the end if we haven't come to it already in the course of the lecture. Somebody thinks he knows them all? It's not really a trick question. That is, there's a great difference in population between number 4 and number 5, but still. What happens is that most people think of Middle Eastern countries, and there are reasons for this, historical precedents of Islam in Middle Eastern countries before it went elsewhere. But in fact, none of the 4 is a Middle Eastern country. That's probably already told you enough so that you won't go too far afield. Everybody always guesses Egypt, Turkey, and places like that. And I bring that up because I want to be clear that tonight when I'm talking about the Muslim world, I'm not just going to talk about the Middle East, which is, of course, of crucial strategic importance, and we hear about it a lot, and it happens to be my field of study, but it shouldn't be all that we concentrate on when we talk about the Muslim world. Now, the first thing I wanted to say is that the mass movements of the type that are talked under that head in Latin America, which tend to be leftish mass movements of one sort or another, especially in recent years, with perhaps some alliance with Catholic and secular forces, will on the whole not be found in the Muslim world. I don't know all the reasons for this. I think in part it's simply that Latin America got its freedom from colonialism so much earlier that in a sense it's gone through more stages and has at least large numbers of people who are more secularist in their orientation than is true in the Muslim world. And so we find that mass movements, that is, movements that really involve masses of the population in the Muslim world, have tended to one degree or another to be Islamic in content, or at least to have large elements that are Islamic in content. This even before the Islamic revival of the last 2 decades, and certainly more true now. Another reason for this difference with an area like Latin America, I think, is the nature of the Islamic religion itself, which I don't reify into a single entity because it's extremely varied both over time and place, but still does nearly always have a political as well as what we would call a religious element. And many people who follow Islam think of it as a total way of life rather than as a part of a way of life. And therefore tend to interpret even what we would regard as radical political ideas in Islamic terms, in reinterpreted Islamic terms, rather than in purely secular terms. This doesn't mean there are no secularists and there are no secular movements. But somewhat ironically, for those who like to structure things in terms of class analysis, and I partially do so, as you move towards the working class and peasants, you get more away, in many cases, from those who take purely secular views, and more toward those who take more Islamic views of the world. And one of the reasons for the so-called Islamic revival of recent years is precisely the entrance of the masses into politics in much greater numbers than before. And the masses of people, partly the petty bourgeoisie, but heavily peasants who've migrated to cities and become workers, or what we call sub-proletariat, sort of casual workers, are very likely to go into Islamic movements of a radical type, as are students and young intellectuals. And so it's true that there has been, especially in recent decades, a kind of Islamic coloring to such mass movements as have existed, which is not quite parallel to Latin America. And I say this realizing that in Latin America there has been an entry of Catholics and even Catholic priests and nuns into liberation movements, and there has been a liberation theology, and a number of people have tried to equate almost the liberation theology of the Catholics in Latin America with radical Islam. And although certain comparisons can be made, I don't think the comparison is entirely justified. Because, first of all, it is not primarily the clerics in Islam who have led this, if you want to call it a liberation theology in the Muslim world. Here, Iran is a bit of an exception, and I'll go into that later. But elsewhere in the Muslim world, it is precisely people who tend to be anti-clerical and to revolt against the interpretation of Islam given by the clerics and not to belong to the clergy who have entered into these movements. They are lay people who give a new interpretation of the religion. And secondly, and perhaps equally as important, in Latin America on the whole, insofar as I understand these movements, guerrilla movements and others, the secularists, including communists, Marxists, and sort of democratic liberal types, have kept, in most cases, a kind of leadership in the movement, which is not paralleled in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world on the whole, when secularists have entered into such movements that heavily involve people with an Islamic identity, it is the secularists who have had to adapt to Islam and somehow call themselves Muslims, or say, well, our idea, Marx, is compatible with Islam, but give the leadership role ideologically as well as politically, in most cases, to the Muslim element. So I think the situations thus far, at least, are not really parallel. Now, when we talk of mass movements through most of the Muslim world and look for them, because they don't exist everywhere, unfortunately, perhaps, for our study, what I think we found, or what I found in trying to put together this lecture, was that most of the mass movements involving the largest number of people in the Muslim world had been what I would call nationalist movements, rather than either leftist movements on the one hand, which have been quite few true leftist movements, or the purely Islamic, well, purely Islamic is overstating, but primarily Islamic movements which to a degree repudiate nationalism, although in some ways also, as we'll see, they reflect it, such as found in Iran in the Islamic Revolution. So that we should at least briefly look at these movements to know what has been the character of most Islamic mass movements. Now, when I say nationalist, I mean a few things. There's a French, well, an Arab scholar who writes in French who would rather call them nationalitarian movements, and that hasn't caught on much in English. But the idea is that nationalist has a kind of a negative, if not conservative, connotation of the kind of nationalists who are already in power and want to expand their state. And what I'm really talking about is people who want to liberate their area from colonial rule and set up a new state. Even if the area is technically liberated, in some cases they regard it as being too subservient to foreigners and want to set up a truly independent state. Now, those movements have sometimes been quite secular. They have tended to be what I call multi-class, on a class scale, as nationalism usually tends to be, going not from the very top, I mean there's a certain group that identifies with the old colonialists, but going from near the top to near the bottom of the class stratification, but often referred to as bourgeois, often having a kind of middle class orientation. And some of these movements have been quite secular, surprisingly so for people who think of the Muslim world in its recent context. Certainly the first of them that I think is important in our context here, the first that had a really mass basis, was that of Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk in Turkey, who did lead a mass movement against the treaty that the Western powers were trying to impose on Turkey after World War I. It was almost a revolutionary movement for its time. Interestingly, in the period when it was a mass movement, it appealed to Islamic slogans, because even in that kind of secular mood of Ataturk, which came to the fore very soon after, there was a clear recognition that when you're really trying to appeal to the masses of the population, you use Islamic means and slogans. And that was done in this period when they were kicking out the Europeans who essentially wanted to divide Turkey and leave it almost nothing in the way of an independent state. And as you probably know, they succeeded in this so that Turkey became the only state that was able to rewrite the treaties that had been written at Versailles and elsewhere after World War I and set up a viable state. Now, other Islamic mass movements, or mass movements in the Muslim world, include those in Indonesia against the Dutch after World War II, which was a massive mass movement, if I may. Indonesia, by the way, is the biggest Muslim country in the world in population. It did include some Islamic organizations, which were in their own way anti-imperialist, but Indonesia has always had a secular constitution, and even though its population has been affected recently by the Islamic revival, or sectors of the population, it's worth remembering that the largest Muslim country in the world today retains its secular constitution, up to date at least, against all attempts to make it more self-consciously and exclusively Islamic. Of course, they have a considerable non-Muslim population, but that in itself, I think, would not keep this Islamic trend out, because Egypt also has for example, also has a considerable non-Muslim population, and yet I can see the possibility of an Islamic movement winning out for a time, at least, in Egypt. So Indonesia was another one of these massive movements that actually fought the Dutch for a number of years and attained freedom under this secular constitution, kept in by even though Sukarno and Suharto were very much opponents, both of them kept to this secularist constitution. And in this immediate post-World War II period, it's interesting, the only state which won its statehood in a kind of a struggle, a kind of a mass movement, which stressed Islam, was Pakistan. And in the case of Pakistan, the reason, I think, was not primarily religious, or in a sense even Islamic in a very broad sense, but because Islam was the only justification for the creation of the state of Pakistan. Before World War II, only a very small number of people thought about the creation of an Islamic state in what had been the subcontinent of India, ruled by the British either directly in most cases or indirectly through princes. Until about World War II, most people thought that if the British gave, or if or when the British gave freedom to this subcontinent, they would give it to a united Hindu-Muslim state. The idea of Pakistan, first put forth in the 1930s, first adopted as a program of the Muslim League, I think in 1940, and the state actually formed in 1947. A really amazingly rapid change. Here we hear for the first time some of the kind of Islamic State slogans that we've heard a lot more recently. And yet even here, interestingly enough, the first leader and the man most influential in bringing about this state was a thorough secularist, not a very good Muslim. And Pakistan resisted for a long time having an identifiably Islamic or exclusively Islamic constitution and series of laws. And it's only very recently that that kind of thing has happened. And even very recently, after the current President Zia-ul-Haq came in by a coup, it is more a case of putting in a few Islamic punishments and a few Islamic laws as a kind of veneer for what is really a military dictatorship than it is of bringing in leaders of Islam in any way to determine the nature of the state. And so we have these various mass movements showing a considerable secularist element, however much there might also be Islamic elements too. And that's also true of the final one of these great nationalist mass movements I'm going to mention. That was the one of the Algerians against the French, in which, again, there were many secularists involved, but there was a kind of identity of the common mass of the population with Islam. And because the French had been so heavily identified with trying to make everything in Algeria French and Western, I think there was a strong reaction against that, even on the part of intellectuals. And so this mass movement took on something of an Islamic specific tone, and there was the notion that they were going to set up a kind of Islamic socialism. But in Algeria, there's nothing like the degree of enforcement of what are regarded as strict Islamic laws that there is in Saudi Arabia or Iran or even Pakistan. Some of them are enforced indeed. Now, so the largest body then of mass movements in the Muslim world have been, if you will, if you don't like nationalists, we can call them national liberation movements, but they've been national liberation movements not with the leftist tone that phrase sometimes has, but much more towards the middle, with either middle-class people or lower middle-class people coming out on top, and governments set up which range from conservative to sort of social democratic, but are not going far off to either the left or the right. There is, however, no question that in recent years, what is variously called the Islamic revival or Islamic resurgence or a number of other things, has been a reality. And in a number of countries of the world, there have been movements that have grown up, which may not be mass movements in the sense that they involve great masses of the population, but that's deceptive, because that often is simply because if they did try to involve great masses of the population, they would be very much more brutally suppressed than they even are now. So I think they represent a genuine sentiment on the part of large numbers in the population, and they have tended to react against secularism, against liberalism, against things Western, and to come forth with ideas which are sometimes called fundamentalist. I sometimes use that word, but you have to remember that fundamentalism is a modern movement, even in the United States where it originated. It's not traditionalist, just going back to the past. Nothing ever goes back to the past, but it's something new and has a strong populist element as well as its fundamentalist claim to go back to the Quran and Quranic punishments and Quranic justice and things of that sort. Now, why the appeal? Of course, it varies from case to case, but I don't have time, unless in the question period, to go into each individual case. Why the appeal in the 60s and 70s of such, I'll call it fundamentalist movements, at the moment are populist movements, Islamic populist movements? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. I'm not sure the order of importance of these reasons, but so I'll just give them to you without any special order. I think, for one thing, there continues to be a much more strongly anti-Western and anti-imperialist feeling in the Muslim world, and particularly the Middle Eastern part of the Muslim world, than in many other parts of even the Third World. This is partly because of the Arab-Israeli issue. That should not be underestimated, in which in Arabized and to some degree in Muslimized, Israel is seen as a remaining outpost, perhaps the last most important, the last important remaining outpost of Western colonialism, which has set itself down in the middle of the Muslim world and is supported by the United States. And so there is a reaction against things Western colonial, Western-like, as in Israel, and a feeling that you need to have an ideology which is totally different from that of the West. Now, this feeling is strengthened by the fact that those governments which imitated Western liberalism, or even Western social democracy, both in the period between the world wars and since, were not seen by the masses of the population or the petty bourgeoisie as having a particularly good record, as having done anything very much for the masses of the population. And therefore the former enthusiasm for such things as constitutions, parliament, liberalism, things of that sort, has largely waned, at least in this period, and the feeling is that something different is needed. Now, in some parts of the world, this something different is needed feeling, I think, has translated itself more often into various forms of Marxism or communism than it has to a return to the past. This has not happened in the Middle East in most cases. I'm not sure of all the reasons, but perhaps the hold of Islam on the masses was stronger than that of somewhat, I hate to use the word more limited, but I think the ideological systems, other ideological systems, are more open to outside penetration or to accommodating themselves to outside ideas in some ways than Islam generally is. And so Marxism, by those who are believing Muslims, in most cases, has been seen as something alien and Western and not too well regarded by them or by their majority either. And so the desire to return to or to go to something which is different from the Westernism that they've been subjected to and haven't liked very much or haven't seen very many results from, was much more likely to go to some version of Islam. Now, both the group that brought in, or the groups that brought in the Islamic part of the Iranian Revolution, and the small groups in Egypt, one of which was responsible for the killing of Sadat, but many other groups active, and the Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere. All of these groups don't just revive Islam, but they create a really new populist version of Islam, which emphasizes certain aspects of Islam, such as social justice and sort of egalitarian ideas in terms of some of their ideologues actually taken from Marxism, but put into an Islamic framework and interpreting Islamic terms in these ways. And as I mentioned, outside of Iran, most of these Islamic movements have non-clerical leaders. They're young people, often people from the campuses of Egypt, let's say, or people from the petty bourgeois in the cities, usually quite well educated, who present a new ideology of what their Islam is. And although, as I've said, in most countries these things are not yet mass movements, I don't at all exclude the possibility that they will become mass movements in countries other than Iran. Now, another thing I think which sped up the spread of this Islamic revival was, somewhat ironically, the oil income received by a number of Islamic states. I went to a conference when I was in France in 1977 on the having to do with the oil exporting states of the other hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, and I hadn't realized until that time that, well, by now you have Britain and Norway, but we were talking about OPEC countries, and aside from Britain and Norway, if you go to the OPEC countries, all the oil exporting states of the Eastern Hemisphere are majority Muslim. Now, I think it's just a coincidence. I don't think it's. I regard oil as a curse, anyhow, in many ways. So that I don't think it's the blessing of Allah. I think it would have to be regarded as somebody's curse. But I'll explain why I regard it as a curse at some point. Maybe not right here. But in any case, why should this oil make a difference towards Islam? Well, a few reasons. One is that, as this conference indicated, as more and more people have seen since, oil is at least not an unmixed blessing, oil income. It has tended, particularly in those countries which have a considerable population, unlike Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, to create a situation where people move very rapidly, migrate very rapidly from the countryside to the cities. It tends to ruin agriculture, to encourage very fancy construction projects and corruption, both of which benefit the wealthy very much, as do some of the other kinds of economic programs it pushes. And so there's a rapid change in demographic patterns toward the cities at the same time as you have an extremely rapid growth in income disparity on the whole between the have-nots and the haves. And even if the have-nots are making a little more, they can see, well, we have, certainly in Iran this operated, we have $20 billion in oil revenue coming in every year, and what do I see of it? I may get a little bit more, but I see everybody driving Mercedes and Cadillacs and things like that and being corrupt. And naturally, this raises the level of discontent, and this, I think, happened. A lot of this discontent got directed towards radical Islamic movements in many of these countries. And you had somewhat similar things on a smaller scale arising in Egypt under Sadat. Even though Egypt was not a significant oil country, it was getting some of the indirect effects from other Arab countries that were oil countries. And you had the same kind of growth and disparity of income, rapid urbanization, and kind of disgust on the part of the petty bourgeoisie intellectuals and subproletariat of the cities. And So this also leads to a notion of turning away from things Western, because you can see once again these big build-up projects and everything are associated with the West and are often owned by multinational corporations. There's a close intertwining with Western interests in these things, and the idea of going back to something indigenous. And the sort of old nationalist ideas based on language, let's say, as in Turkey or Iran. When I say old, I mean about 40 years old. They had become associated with the ruling elite in these countries. And so once again, you have a notion of turning back to Islam. And often you turn against whatever it is you have. I mean, in our countries, you see that in very simple ways when throw the rascals out when the times are bad. And even now in Europe, you see that the countries with left governments are turning right, and the countries with right governments are turning left when they're all going through bad times. So on a larger scale, I think the people who saw westernized governments doing badly in a variety of ways would say, well, what's our alternative now? And if they had been in a period when the rulers were sort of traditionally Muslim, as indeed happened in various times since the beginning of the 20th century in these countries, they said, well, the way to improve things must be to become more like the West. But then if after a period of years that hadn't worked out very well, then there was a natural tendency among many of them to say the thing to do is go back to Islam. Now, these aren't exactly the same classes. I think I've indicated that already. The people who tend to be the most westernized were more Western tied in big traders or bourgeois or Western educated people, whereas the people who tend to be more Islamic are often from lower in the class or stratification scale. Nonetheless, this contrasting trend that I mentioned, I think, does exist. Now, with all this background, we could look very briefly at the Iranian Revolution, which is a major phenomenon, the major phenomenon as a mass movement, I think, in this Islamic revival, although, as I've indicated, I don't think it's necessarily the last. We won't see, I think, a massive movement of this scale again. I mean, it's something practically unique in world history. People in urban centers going out in the millions and standing up to being shot at and things of that sort. But we may see some mass movements in other countries. Now, why Iran? I don't pretend to know all the compensation offered, directed against the British primarily, in order to assure Iranian independence from foreign control. This lasted only 2 years, from 1951 to 53, at which point it was overthrown with a great deal of U.S. and British planning in the overthrow, although there were important sections of the Iranian population which also joined into this. This is sometimes forgotten. I was mentioning, I think at dinner, that people often tend to look at things as simply the virtuous third world countries against the vicious Western countries. I think this is an oversimplification. Within each country, whether third world or Western world, you have very contradictory forces, and you did there too. Now, this was a mostly secularist movement again, towards even the mostly secularist end of the various nationalist movements I talked about. It did have some religious allies, some of the most important of whom actually left the movement before it finished and joined in with the opposition. And there were clerical elements in the opposition to Mossadegh that were very important. But when we come to 78, 79, you have quite a different picture of heavy clerical involvement. Now, again, I'm not sure I can analyze all the reasons for this change. Partly, it was simply that, and this may apply to other countries later too, it's much easier to suppress secular opposition movements in the Muslim world than it is to suppress the clergy. It's almost impossible to suppress the clergy. That's very important. And indeed, the secular opposition movements were suppressed and hounded. The Shah had a very effective secret police. And the National Front practically ceased to exist. The two-day party leadership went abroad, almost ceased to exist. The only thing you had that was active were small guerrilla movements, which have since become much larger movements, the Mujahideen and the Fedayeen. But these really were not, they had sympathy in the population, but they didn't have great numbers, as far as we know, in terms of members before the revolution. Now, it's relatively easy if you've got an efficient secret police and are despotic to put down these movements or to reduce them considerably. But it's very hard with the clergy. That is, you'd get a cleric making a statement in a mosque about tyranny 1,000 years before, and martyrs and opposition and justice and things like that. There's a kind of a code where you knew which tyrant was really being referred to and which martyrs and which strugglers were really being referred to under the names of people who had lived hundreds of years before. And you can't arrest somebody for talking about that. And so there grew up a kind of a loose network of an oppositional clergy. Certainly not all the clergy were opposed to the Shah. That's a kind of a myth that people have now. But important numbers were. Because of some of the reasons I indicated in the rise of Islamic sentiment, there was a kind of a coalescence of this movement on the part of some of the clergy, generally those who came from peasant rural origins, with a kind of new intellectual movement towards Islam, associated particularly with a person named Ali Shariati, which actually incorporated some Marxist and socialist ideas into its interpretation of Islam. These two things went with this kind of over-rapid economic change. And it wasn't only over-rapid, but it was the way it was done. Top-heavy, everything going to favor the people at the top rather than the bottom. This plus the general reaction against the secret police, against various forms of oppression, and an economic downturn beginning 75 or 76, which is the kind of thing that often precedes a revolution, an upward turn for a while and then a downturn. These things all created a very volatile situation, which did indeed culminate in revolution. That's a very schematic thing I've had to go into because so briefly because of the time at my fingers or wherever it is. But I wanted to go over it briefly to say that although some of these elements exist in other countries, the structure of the Iranian clergy was something quite different which doesn't exist in other countries. As some of you know, Iran is what we call a Shiite country, and not Sunni as the majority of Muslim countries, partly because of that and partly because of simply the historical evolution of Iran. The Iranian clergy has been probably the most independent clergy in the world, independent of the government. They have their own income, their own taxes, their own networks. And this put them in a position to develop political leadership of the opposition to the Shah in various periods over about a century. This isn't the first time, although it's the biggest. And so that gave them a kind of unique base, which is not true of the other Islamic movements in the Muslim world. As I've already suggested, those movements are not clerical by and large. By and large, the clergy in those countries tend to follow whatever government is in power. In Egypt, you have beautiful quotations about socialism and liberalism and whatever it was Nasser wanted to pass, coming from the leadership of the clergy. These people are despised by these new Islamic movements. But the fact that these new movements don't have that kind of base in the clergy means not only that they're different from Latin America, but more important that they're different from Iran, and I think makes it unlikely that we're going to see that kind of large-scale, mass, clerically led movement that would repeat the Iranian Revolution. But we may see other kinds of movements that, in fact, in some cases will come into power. But I just want to say, or could come into power. But before I leave it for questions on that last note about the possibility of coming into power in other countries, and I wouldn't make a particular prediction, by the way, on any particular country. Egypt is certainly a possibility, but I don't know whether it's going to happen. There is also the other side of this coin that should be remembered, and that is that in the Muslim world, as elsewhere, ideological or political trends come and go, they go up and they go down. And although what we've been seeing in the last 15 years or so tends to be moving in the direction of what's called Islamic revival, I think that this is not necessarily a permanent trend, and I think people can get just as disgusted with Islamic governments as they got with those they regarded as too Western or secular. I happened to be talking to some people the other day who said that this was already happening in Pakistan, whereas I said Zia-ul-Haq, in a sense, was just using Islamic punishments and Islamic laws on the whole to cloak a military dictatorship, which is not all that popular. Now, of course, you can react two ways to this. You can say, this is not real Islam, and we're going to bring in real Islam. But it seems that in Pakistan, at least some people of important numbers are reacting in the opposite direction and saying we'd rather have the more secular kind of government we had before this government. So I think particularly once a government calling itself Islamic comes into power and doesn't come through, just as the previous secular governments haven't come through, we're more likely to see a movement to various kinds of secular solutions, whether liberal on the one hand or leftist on the other in a number of these countries. So in other words, the Islamic revival, while very real, I don't think is necessarily a permanent phenomenon. This doesn't mean that I think Islam is going to disappear by any means any more than Christianity has, but that since it can be interpreted in any number of directions, that there, at least in some countries in the foreseeable future, may be a secularist counter-trend, not anti-Islamic, I think, but one which tries to bring in more secular kinds of reforms and perhaps reach something more affected by the masses of the people, to reach the masses of the people as few of these earlier secularist countries have, if it's insisted upon by the masses of the people themselves. Okay. Okay, I'll take my own questions. I'll just say before I do that that I'd like them to be really questions, and that I'm not going to engage in long dialogues with any individual. Okay? Yes.
Can you take any comments, please?
Brief, very brief.
You mentioned about the national movements in the Muslim world in the 50s or before that, and you mentioned the name of Kemal Atatürk, and he succeeded to stop the Muslim world. To correct that, Kemal Atatürk came into power by the Western leaders. They made him to be a hero. So, and one of the issues to be a leader is that he should disconnect all his relation with the other Muslim world. It used to be really refuse to ride American airplane or a Western car, but we don't have the same situation as the Industrial Revolution when it started in the Western world. There's a lot of corruption happening in the society itself here. If that revolution or if that Western thing is gonna bring corruption, that's what we are against with. The second reason you mentioned that some of those movements nowadays, they are taking Marxism phrases and just reinterpret it in a shape of a Muslim movement. And I want to say that Islam was born and come into power even before Marx himself was born and before all of those people. Islam has its own identity. If there is a similarity